Robert Schumann has been dead a full century, and still today he remains a focus of controversy. People find themselves full of opinions about the worth of his music, about whether he deserves to rank in the great succession that followed Beethoven, about the relation between his romanticism and his ultimate insanity, about his legendary inability to orchestrate well, about his incompetence to deal with the symphonic form, and so on and on. Schumann is one of those special tastes that can send casual shipboard acquaintances rushing into each other's arms, or can make enemies of otherwise loving friends. But nobody will deny Schumann's great gifts, the inspired lyricism that soars out of his best works, the uncanny stream of newnesses that succeed each other in such profusion, the warmth, the singing tides, the rhythmic ingenuities, and the daring experimentalism. Still, one criticism remains that is shared by so many critics and musicians and simple music lovers that it should be looked into with some care, and that is the charge that Schumann was a bad orchestrator. This charge is so widely held to be true that I hesitate to be so bold as to re-examine it, yet perhaps by looking at the music and listening, we may see that the charge is greatly exaggerated, and at the same time we may learn something of what good orchestration really means. Well, first let's decide what orchestration means. It is simply the setting of music for orchestra, the mating of notes with their most suitable instrumental colors. In other words, it is an orchestral synonym for instrumentation. Well, what is instrumentation? If you are writing a piece for a sextet, let's say, consisting of piano, clarinet, 2 violins, a viola, and a cello, then you must decide which notes go to what instrument, who will play the melodies, and who the accompaniments and the counterpoints, how these instruments are going to blend together, whether the clarinet or the viola would be the better choice for a particular tune, whether the cello should accompany pizzicato or bowed, how to keep the piano from drowning out the strings. All that is instrumentation. On a larger scale, it becomes orchestration, the solution of those same problems, but in terms of a symphony orchestra, which can involve 100-odd men and infinite variety. This would naturally seem to be a harder job. There are more balances to make, more choices, requiring a greater capacity to juggle all these possible sounds. And yet, in some ways, it's easier. It's actually hard not to write well for orchestra, since the very bigness of the sounding body can cover up a multitude of sins. Now, what then do we mean by a good orchestrator? We mean one who uses the orchestra for the most intense and direct expression of his musical thought. Much, of course, depends on the value of his musical thought to begin with. We always say that Berlioz was a great orchestrator, and we say the same of Rimsky-Korsakov. But if we are speaking of those works of theirs which are not intrinsically of much musical worth, then we cannot mean what we say. For if the music is not first class, no amount of brilliant or beautiful orchestration can save it or have any meaning of its own. It is then only fancy hackwork. By this definition, therefore, Beethoven was a great orchestrator, even though he's usually not singled out for this special gift, but he was because he used the powers of orchestral combinations to tell his music more clearly, and for no other separate or superficial purpose. To my mind, Schumann follows in this tradition. Like Beethoven, he regarded the orchestra as a means and not an end. It may be because of this that he fell into traps or came up against orchestral problems that he never solved. That's why so many conductors have felt free to make so-called versions of the 4 Schumann symphonies. At one point, it became almost a conductor's duty to rearrange Schumann's orchestration so that it would sound richer and fuller and more like orchestration of a later day. Many of these same conductors have done the same with passages in Beethoven's symphonies on the same grounds, although to a far slighter degree. One doesn't so easily tamper with the great god Beethoven. But with poor old Schumann, everyone seems to have the license to tamper as he pleases. In fact, it has become almost traditional to do so. In the recording of the Second Symphony, which accompanies this record, You will hear no tampering, nothing but the notes Schumann wrote, played by the instruments for which he wrote them. Not even the all-too-common device of doubling the woodwind parts has been employed. That is, the use of 4 flutes when Schumann called for 2, and so on down the line, a device intended to give greater power and richness to the wind body. But why should this doubling be necessary? After all, as you can hear, the woodwinds in simple pairs are perfectly audible throughout, and just as rich as Schumann wished them, no richer. The conductor's duty, therefore, is to balance his orchestra in such a way that everything is heard in proportion, rather than to rewrite Schumann's score in order to attain an effect Schumann never intended. Now let's look at the symphony itself and see what Schumann has done. The first movement begins with a strange and moving introduction that is remarkable on several counts. First of all, the initial motive is proclaimed softly by the brass alone, against a quietly moving texture of strings. In this opening passage, Schumann has already made a significant contribution to the history of orchestration by using the brass instruments for his main singing line. True, this line is rather in the nature of a trumpet call, or one might say even a bugle call. But because it is uttered in so soft and solemn a way, it acquires an amazingly lyrical quality, a feeling of quiet mystery, as though this were not just a trumpet call, but one that came from the furthest reaches of the universe. You see, up until Schumann's time, the brass department of the orchestra had been used in a minimal way to strengthen loud or percussive chords, to give accents, or to act as the spine, so to speak, of the orchestra. But rarely had the brass been used for melodic purposes. After all, the strings were made for singing. They are born melodists. And the same is true of the various wind instruments, but not so the brass instruments with their excessive power and their restricted ranges and their biting attacks on notes. If you were writing a symphony and had invented a lyrical opening theme that you loved and were proud of, you'd undoubtedly prefer to entrust it to the cradling warmth of the violins or to the sweet penetrating clarity of an oboe or flute, rather than to the comparative clumsiness of the stentorian brass. How brave and fresh of Schumann, therefore, to have begun his second symphony with this unprecedented use of quiet brass. And not only does he have 2 trumpets articulating the call, but 2 horns as well. And what is really exceptional, a trombone to boot, singing away quietly in unison with the second trumpet. Again, Schumann has broken orchestral tradition, since the trombones had always been used most sparingly of all the brass instruments. In no symphony of Beethoven do they appear anywhere except in the final movement for a special climactic effect. And even at that, this is true of only 2 out of his 9 symphonies. But Schumann belonged to that glorious age of the new Romanticism, the early days of orchestral pioneering and expansion that followed hard upon the death of Beethoven in 1827. And so we can understand the temerity of opening a symphony with a singing trombone 100 years before Tommy Dorsey. I've dwelt at such length on the introduction to this first movement in order to build up material for argument against the old bromide that Schumann orchestrated only for strings. True, his orchestra, like most orchestras, is firmly founded on the string section, which is the most versatile, flexible, and easily handled part of the orchestra. And it is also true that he sometimes overworks his string players, as we shall see. But in the main, his interests lay in developing the orchestra to meet the demands of his music. And so we see that throughout this long introduction, the strings do not once take over the lead until the very last bars. Under the brass utterance, they provide a kind of thick, animated carpet of tone, warm, rich, and calm, on which the mysterious calls in the brass can stand, nobly outlined and radiant. Then the winds take over, having had little or nothing to do so far. 4 bars of exquisitely orchestrated singing by the full woodwind choir. And as they continue, they join the string texture already established at the beginning to form even a richer carpeting for the re-entrance of the brass motive. And now those same winds become agitated with the timpani aiding and abetting them, but the strings are still in a subordinate role. Against this increasing agitation, the brass call is sounded for the 3rd time and developed. Who can say now that Schumann is a slave to the strings? A less academic treatment of the orchestra in classical terms would be hard to find. Unacademic, too, is the bridge from this introduction to the allegro proper. It's a gradual acceleration by the violins, who dominate for the first time, from a slow tempo to the main fast one. Notice how Schumannesque this is, with the almost neurotic accents in unexpected places and the tense harmonies.